Thank you for joining us in the Allyship, a Lifestyle series hosted by Region 1 of the SNMA. We hope this space allows us to exchange ideas and practice essential skills in being effective allies in the fight for racial justice alongside our Black peers, faculty members, and community members.
Okay, so welcome everybody. My name is Kelton. I'm a fourth year at UC Irvine School of Medicine, he, him, and I am pleased to welcome you tonight to our session with our speaker, Mike Knox. I want to first, before introducing our speaker, hold space for two people who were brought into national consciousness this weekend because of their attempted murder and murder at the hands of police. And their names are Trayford Pellerin and Jacob Blake. I wanted to start briefly by just mentioning the life of Trayford Pellerin. He was described by his mother as a kind, intelligent, quiet, and shy man who loved to cook, was close with his extended family, and was caring and helpful. In a memorial article, his Aunt Choicey Pellerin's favorite memories of Mr. Pellerin were described as his smile and his meals. She recalled for the brief period when the two lived together, he would make sure she came home from work every day to make a home-cooked meal, or he would make sure she came home every day to a home-cooked meal. Another memorial article noted that Mr. Pellerin was working different industrial and construction jobs, but had talked about the idea of returning to school and possibly studying law. He died after being shot 11 times by police last Friday, August 21st, 2020, in Lafayette, Louisiana. I also wanted to bring into our consciousness tonight Jacob Blake, and we can go to the next slide. Jacob Blake is a 29-year-old father, son, uncle, and cousin. He is a former high school wrestler who after high school moved from his hometown of Evanston, Illinois to Kenosha, Wisconsin. He is from a distinguished family, being the grandson of Jacob Blake Sr., lead pastor at Evanston's Ebenezer AME Church during the 1960s and 70s, who fought for years for fair housing. Mr. Blake is currently in recovery in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, after being shot 7 times by police officers on Sunday, August 23rd, 2020. So we bring these two names into your consciousness tonight because now more than ever is the time for allyship that is reflective, humble, and active. To help us in this process, it is my pleasure to introduce you all to our speaker for today, Mike Knox. Mike serves as the founding director of the Center for Student Leadership at UCI, where he has worked in various roles related to student development for almost 14 years. His efforts include various courses, trainings, and consultation work to create positive social change. And he earned a bachelor's degree in psychology and social behavior from UCI and a master's in higher education and organizational change from UCLA. Outside of his work, he describes himself as a gamer, a dad to 2 awesome kids, a partner to the literal best human on the planet, and an imperfect agent of social change, constantly working to make both himself and the world around him better. So thank you for joining us today, Mike, and I'll turn it over to him.
Thank you so much, Kelton, for the kind introduction and also for holding space. Before I move on, I do want to just recognize that I know a lot of people are holding a lot right now, and I just want to encourage you throughout to do whatever it is you need to do to take care of yourself. I don't expect that I'll be presenting anything that could be triggering, but I just want to encourage you, please take the best care of yourself that you can. So I'm here to talk about whiteness, basically. And in addition to spending a lot of time studying this topic and using this topic in my work for many, many years, I have also lived 40 years as a white man. So I've got some lived experience as well that I'll share a little bit of. Today is about making the things that are so often invisible about whiteness visible, and having a conversation about what that actually looks like in the context of this broader conversation you all have been facilitating throughout. So thank you all. It's a privilege to be with you all. I really, truly appreciate it. Just as a quick overview of the agenda, we'll be talking about a little bit about terminology, very briefly on that. Then we'll dive into the topic of white culture. There are 4 areas in particular that I want to explore. They're not the only 4 that we could, but I'll start there. There's going to be a conversation about white racial identity. So we're going to start broad in terms of culture and then really come inward and talk about more of the individual. Moving on from there, I've got a maybe next to the cycle of oppression. There's a lot of content here, and I apologize in advance because I'm not going to do it all justice in the amount of time that we have, but we're going to do the best that we can. And if we get that far, we'll have that conversation about the cycle of oppression as well, and we will definitely be talking about anti-racism. So to get us started, I'm going to assume that people have an understanding of what the word race means, but something that I did want to bring to the conversation because in past presentations and workshops, folks have been surprised to learn this, is really what the history of the term means or where it comes from. A lot of folks assume that the idea of race has been with humans as long as there have been humans, right, who have recognized that there are people who look different from them. That is absolutely not the case. The concept of race as we know it today was an invention in the early 18th century, and it was an invention specifically designed to uphold the enslavement of African people. I don't have time to get too much into the history, but at this time, slavery in general was becoming very unpopular, right? Slavery existed in a lot of spaces in a lot of ways. There's indentured servitude, there's all sorts of different ways that it's exhibited, but it was becoming very unpopular with people generally, right? And so this idea of Blackness was invented, and this idea of race was invented to say, you're right, slavery is wrong for some people, but if we can define certain people as less than human, we can continue to have slavery, if that makes sense. So that's a very brief overview of what that looks like and doesn't do the history justice, but there you go. So the idea of race as we know it in the US has an explicitly anti-Black foundation. And that's important for all of us to think about as we do work on any topics related to race and racism, that if you're passionate about doing work, for example, on anti-Asian racism, there's a foundation of anti-Blackness that informs that work as well. And so you are served by doing work to combat anti-Blackness, no matter what your goals are. All right, I'm going to move a little bit quicker because I realize I'm already going too slow. So definitions of race have changed throughout history, and they have changed in order to uphold white supremacy. They were, again, invented to create white supremacy. And so a great example of this is that in the history of the US, not everybody who is considered white today was considered white. Irish people are a great example of that. When Irish people started immigrating to the United States, their situation and their kind of lot in life was much more similar to Black folks than it was to other white folks. That there was a great opportunity for to come together in community, to collaborate. There was actually a lot of pressure from folks back in Ireland to say you should be joining with the abolition movement, you should be fighting against slavery. And there was a moment where that could have happened. And strategically, and again, the history is much more complicated than I'm going to give it justice right now, but strategically what happened is essentially Irish people were invited into the fold of whiteness, right? And that was just too tempting. That meant a much better life than the alternative. And so part of that, though, was also accepting white supremacy. And again, that's a history that we can't fully dig into right now. Whiteness, also a creation at this time. The term white actually doesn't really come into the kind of lexicon until slave codes are created. And white at that time is used to define white indentured servants in opposition to Black slaves. And it was used in a legal sense to define the rights that those white indentured servants had, such as the right to own property, to learn to read and write, that sort of thing, that Black slaves did not have access to. This kind of activity of tiering folks, right, is a long-held historical and present-day strategy to create division, right? So if poor, incredibly poor white folks can be convinced that they're better than Black folks, suddenly they're not realizing the reason that they're poor and that they're in the circumstances they are actually other white folks, right, who are wealthy and who have the resources. But this is what happens around the same time that I described before. So just as race has been defined as explicitly anti-Black, whiteness from its inception was explicitly defined in opposition to Blackness. I'm going to define white people also, and I think this is important because I just said some pretty intense stuff about whiteness, right? And that whiteness historically is very much tied up in the idea of white supremacy. White people are people who happen to have been born white. And nobody asked for that. Nobody made a decision about that, right? You are who you are because you were born that way. And so everything that I said about whiteness is not to try to tear down white people. I myself am a white person, right? It's to own what is the social construct around us. And white people, whether or not we're bought into white supremacy, are part of a system that upholds white supremacy. And we're going to talk about that. So let's talk about white culture a little bit. I'm borrowing this. Oh gosh, my citation at the bottom is covered by my controls. But, oops, sorry. I'm borrowing this as just a general kind of layout to get the conversation started. You can look at it, you can do a screenshot, whatever it is you want to do to record this, because I'm not going to talk about all these things. But as you can see, there are a lot of things that tend to describe white culture in the United States. That doesn't mean they describe every white person or white family in the United States, but these are tendencies. That's what culture is, right? It's a collection of things that we tend to do. So you can see here, right, holidays based on Christian religion, based on the history of white male leaders typically. I was talking with Kelton a moment ago and kind of wondering coming into this, like how many non-Black people learned what Juneteenth is this year, right? And these are the stories that don't get told because whiteness is the dominant story and tends to take up all of the space. Things, rugged individualism, right? That people get what they deserve. This world is a meritocracy, and everybody who is successful has worked hard and has earned that, and anybody who is not successful by the definition of successful, meaning material wealth and things like that, right? They didn't work hard enough and it's their fault. There's all kinds of things here that we can talk about. Family structure, the nuclear family, right? We don't have extended family members living with us in our household, things like that. I'm going to focus on 4 particular areas as I move forward. The first is going to be talking about whiteness, the idea of whiteness as normal, the idea of whiteness as a baseline. There's a myth in the United States of whiteness or white being objective, where everybody else is subjective, right? As if there's no such, as if there is such a thing as objectivity. And the thing about privilege is that when you have it, you don't have to see it. You don't have to name it. Right? So if you pay attention to the news or stories generally about people, or let's say even naming somebody's profession, right? If I talk about a pilot and I don't say anything else, generally I'm talking about a white male pilot, right? But if I was going to talk about a woman, I would say a woman pilot or a female pilot. If I was going to talk about a Black female pilot, I would say that, right? Like we have to name those things for other folks. And so an example of that in my own work, I work in education. This is a poster advocating for ethnic studies, which CSU system just adopted ethnic studies as a requirement for all students. So that's an exciting new event. Ethnic studies, if you all are students, right? Or most of the folks here are students. If you're, as an undergraduate, if you wanted to learn about Black history, for example, where would you take your classes? You would take, if your school offered them, you would take African American studies classes, right? If I wanted to learn about white history, I would just take history, right? We don't have to name it again. It's the default. It's the standard. In medicine, great example of that is, who is medical research standardized around? It's standardized around young white men and has been historically since the beginning, right? And so what does that mean in terms of the care folks are getting? What does that mean in terms of the knowledge around what the needs of individuals are who don't fall into that young white male category? Again, on the topic of white culture, I want to talk about patriotism, or what I would say is the whitewashing of history, a particular brand of patriotism that basically insists that the United States is the greatest country that has ever existed and always will be, right? And our founding fathers were infallible, and nothing we do is ever wrong. And so what does that look like? So this is actually a screenshot from an HBO show called Watchmen, which is based on a graphic novel. This is Tulsa, 1921. I'm not going to talk too much about the actual event, but this is the Tulsa Race Massacre, in which, excuse me, armed white men invaded a neighborhood called Greenwood, otherwise known as Black Wall Street in Tulsa. and burned down 35 city blocks. 8,000 people were left homeless. 800 people were injured, and as many as 300, the count is not definite, as many as 300 were killed in this neighborhood. And we don't need to get into all of what led up to it and all that, but this is an event from history that if anybody on this call right now didn't already know about this, that's not an accident. This is the kind of thing that is deliberately left out of our history books, right? And so an interesting fact about the fact that this screenshot is from the television show is after that first episode aired and this scene was depicted, tons of people went on the message boards and were complaining about HBO being a social justice warrior and making up this event because they didn't know about it, right? And there was this idea that nothing so horrific could have actually happened in our history because that history is hidden from us. That's part of white culture is putting on those rose-tinted glasses and looking back on the history as you know, this make America great again idea, right? So back to medicine. So here are 3 different examples of history that a lot of folks may not know. On the left, you'll see this is actually a protest of a monument of Dr. James Marion Sims, known as the father of modern gynecology, who became that by conducting horrific experiments on Black slaves, on women, right? There's also the Tuskegee experiment, which maybe more folks are familiar with, and that was 399 Black men with syphilis who were studied over the course of 40 years, and in that time were led to believe that they were being treated, but were not being treated, right? We're not being at any time given anything, even when a cure had been discovered, we're still not being treated properly for that, so that they could study what was happening to these men over that time. On the right, that's Henrietta Lacks, who had cancer cells biopsied without her knowledge and without her consent. And those cells have been since multiplied and are now all over the world being used in research. And it wasn't until sometime in the 70s that her family even found out that this was happening. And those cells are still there, again, without consent. And she and her family never in any way benefited from the research and development that have come out of literally taking part of her body, right? And keeping it beyond her death and distributing it around the earth. So these are things that get hidden from us, right? These are histories that we don't necessarily get to know about. I'm going to talk about color blindness, or what I would argue is whitewashing the present, right? So color blindness, the idea that race doesn't really exist, or I don't see race, right? This is something that is fairly common nowadays amongst white folks. And there's an idea that if you talk about race, that makes you the real racist, right? Like we're not supposed to do that, or we're supposed to be polite, or whatever goes along with that. There's a great book called Racism Without Racists, written by Eduardo Bonilla Silva that I would recommend. The whole book is about this, but in one part he talks about frames of colorblind racism, which are essentially rationalizations for why seemingly racist phenomena exist, that we can say, no, it's not really racism, it's something else, right? Or that we can push back against trying to do anti-racist work. So the first is abstract liberalism, the idea that, you know, equality above all is the most important thing. And a really great example of what that looks like today is when somebody says, no, all lives matter, right? It's this idea that kind of sounds good on paper. It's like, yeah, of course that's true, but it's not really, it's not a real argument. It's, I am going to derail your argument, right? It's, I'm going to stop talking about the thing that I'm uncomfortable with, because I don't talk about race. I don't want to see race. I don't want to acknowledge race because that's an uncomfortable place for me to be. So I find ways to avoid it. Naturalization is the idea that, you know, this stuff is just going to happen. It's nobody's fault, right? Like, communities are segregated because people like to hang out with their own people and people who are like them. It's just a choice. And we don't have to talk about redlining. We don't have to talk about discriminatory loan practices and things like that because, oh, everybody chose to be where they're at, right? Cultural racism is the new biological racism. We can't say anymore that somebody is biologically inferior. That's not allowed. But you can say that somebody's culturally inferior. You know, if only they got their act together and acted more like us, they'd be just fine. Right. And now I'm not saying that you're inherently inferior. I'm able to connect it to something else. And then finally, minimization. The idea that, yeah, maybe racism is around, but it's not really that big of a deal anymore. You know, after all, we had a Black president, we're doing fine, or racism exists, but it's like, it's in the South, it's not in California where we're so, you know, enlightened or whatever else, right? Or I've heard people say, you know, if it wasn't race, it would be something else, so we might as well just let it be, right? And like these ideas that this is not something that's central to life, that's impacting people in profound and deadly ways. It's just no big deal, right? Finally, I'm going to talk about professionalism, and this is one that I know I had a call with some of the organizers of the event and this whole series, right, and some of your facilitators about this, and this seemed to resonate. The idea of professionalism and where does that come from? And professionalism in the United States and the world is very much organized around whiteness, around maleness, around heterosexuality, around, and when I say maleness too, a cisgendered, very narrow type of masculinity, right? There's a lot of things kind of boxing that in, right? In terms of how do you dress to be professional? How do you speak, right? What's the dialect and slang that you're allowed to use? How do you present yourself? What types of things are you allowed to bring into the workplace and talk about in terms of your personal life and things like that? And what things are off limits? And can you come in and talk about the fact that you're hurting right now because of what's been happening in the rest of the world? Or is that not okay because that's considered unprofessional where you work, right? Like these kinds of big questions about professionalism. And so this is something that was showing up quite a bit on my social media feed probably a few weeks ago, maybe a month ago, because time means nothing now and I don't know how long it actually was. This was somebody who had done a search for professional hairstyles for work and then just looked at the image results for that. I've actually done this search myself and it still looks something like this, but now you get a lot of results of people commenting on the fact that this is happening. So it's changed the outcomes a little bit. But as you can see, right, professional hairstyles for work, we've got this screen just filled with white women. And mostly blondish white women too, right? Like it's even a narrower like subset within that. And that's who shows up. You do the exact same search, but you add "un" to the beginning, and suddenly all of the results change, right? And the results, for the most part, are Black women wearing their hair in the way that it naturally grows from their head, right? But that has been defined as unprofessional. And this is true for so many things that aren't adhering to whiteness, right? And what does that mean in terms of, you know, your future in medicine, whatever that looks like for you, and the spaces that you'll be navigating, perhaps as a Black woman, perhaps not though. And what does that look like in terms of allyship, right? And how you can start to shift things and change things. I think I'm running very long right now, so I'm going to try to rush through this. White racial identity, I promised I would talk about this, so we're going to go here. I'm going to share with you a model developed by Janet Helms, a Black psychologist. I think in the 90s, we originally created this model. It's the most well-known model of white racial identity development. You can see A Race is a Nice Thing to Have, the book that it's in right there. Two things to note. First, this is not a stage model, and that racial identity is a dynamic process. And the reason I share those two things is what I'm going to present to you now, it can easily come across as like, okay, so white people, they start at stage 1, then they go to 2, 3, 4, and they eventually get to 6, and they're all done, right? But that's not what this is. She actually refers to these as statuses, and argues that you can be dominant in different statuses at different times. You can progress, you can regress. Things can change depending on circumstances and context, right? So very quickly, I'm going to talk about this. The first status is contact status. Excuse me. So this is kind of where I would argue most white folks in the United States are. This is a very colorblind, not really having direct interaction with you know, people of color generally, growing up in a white neighborhood, going to a white school, you know, working in a mostly white profession or office or whatever, wherever you're working, right? And it's a lot of obliviousness, right? Like, well, I'm not experiencing any of this. I'm not seeing racism, so therefore racism doesn't exist. Within that, an unconscious association, as we said here, that whiteness equals normal, right? Or whiteness equals American, or things like that. So this idea of like, why are we always talking about race? I don't see color. That's not for me. That's really indicative of this particular status. Disintegration status is something that can occur folks when, if you're familiar with the term cognitive dissonance, right? When we experience something that's just so contrary to what we believe about the world that suddenly it's shaken us up and we have to either reconcile our thoughts or somehow change our behavior, right? The way we interact. So that's what this looks like. So an example of this, like how is it possible that the officers who killed George Floyd could have felt justified in that moment? That question is keeping me up at night. What does that mean? Because I genuinely, prior to this, had believed that racism was a thing of the past. But now I just witnessed it in such a blatant way. What do I do with that knowledge, right? So it's a very anxiety-driven space. It can be marked by guilt and other feelings and a lot of confusion. Just as with racial progress in the United States, in terms of this model, even moving through these statuses can look like regressing. So the next one is reintegration status. And this is basically not dealing well at all with the anxiety from the previous status and saying, you know what, no, this isn't a problem of whiteness, right, or racism or whatnot. It's starting to ask questions of how do I blame the victim, essentially, although they wouldn't say that, right? So the question of like, what did he do to deserve it, right? How can we justify this thing that was so horrific? But how do we find a way to say that actually, no, it makes sense. It aligns with my view of the world again, right? And this can be, now it's not even so much colorblindness, it can be like a very angry sort of a phase of like, how dare you tell me that racism exists, right? And it can be a very dangerous status. Pseudo-independence is kind of moving from the space of, beginning to understand, well, maybe whiteness actually is a thing, right? And a lot of the statuses before this are really about, I'm an individual, don't call me white, like this kind of thing. Here it's like, oh, maybe I'm kind of sort of getting that. And it's an idea of, kind of performative, like, yes, we should all get along and equality is important, but not a real commitment to that. There can be a real kind of paternalism involved in this of like, I'm recognizing that racial inequality exists. I'm still buying into the idea though that it's your fault. So let me help you. Let me help you be more like me, right? That kind of an attitude. Immersion and immersion. This is, sorry. So this is, again, moving further along, starting to think about, oh, maybe white privilege actually exists, right? Like it's not just whiteness, but there's something more to this. Starting to understand that racism, really is a real thing, and that it's a real thing in my life as well. It's not just something external out there, right? That I can point at. This can also be kind of a performative space. It's not necessarily about action, but it's more about feeling, right? So this idea of I am an ally, like I'm identifying as an ally, but allyship is not an identity. Allyship is action. And so there's still not quite there yet. When I say they, I should say we, right? I've been in all of these places, and I don't have time to talk about it, but I could if anybody's interested at another time. And then finally, autonomy status. This is really, for me, the biggest change here is that we're talking about action, right? That we're saying, oh my gosh, I, a white person, actually am part of, this larger system, and I need to do something about it, right? So I've been given extra time in the chat, and I'm already running over that. So I think I'm gonna probably not get to the next portion of this, but I do wanna share this quote on the screen. I highly recommend everybody read this book if you get a chance. To sum it up, Beverly Daniel Tatum compares white supremacy to the walkway at the airport that kind of moves you along in your luggage and whatnot. And basically says there are three ways that you can behave on this walkway or behave with regard to white supremacy as a white person. You can be actively racist, which is that person who's like, yep, I'm moving right along with this walkway. I know where it's taking me and I'm all about it and I'm going to get ahead, right? You can be passively racist, which I would argue describes most people, including myself at times. That is, that's that kind of, I'm going to be neutral, right? I'm just going to stand here. I'm not doing anything to harm anybody, but I'm also not challenging the system. And that walkway is moving me along, whether I like it or not, whether I notice it or not. Or you can be actively anti-racist, which means I'm going to turn around and I'm going to go the other way. I'm going to do the work to challenge myself, to challenge my communities, et cetera, to do better. So I'm going to apologize because I did not time this well. I was right that this was a maybe. So I'm going to skip right through most of this quickly. What I will say about this cycle, you might be able to gather something from it just by seeing it, right? The idea oftentimes is that, oh, stereotypes are these ideas, they build into feelings, which is prejudice, which turns into individual action, which is discrimination, which becomes oppression, which is institutionalized discrimination. That's one way to think about it. But going back to that exploration of kind of the history of race, right, in the beginning, that really it's the oppression that came first. So the stereotypes and these ideas are the post hoc kind of explanation for why this oppression is valid, right? So if we create a bunch of stereotypes and we can engender prejudice in people against a particular group of people, then we can maintain the structures that oppress them, and by contrast, privilege us, right? So that's the general idea. This was an example from some research I was involved in grad school. It's a really good example. If anybody wants to hit me up after this, I'm happy to share it with you, what that looks like. And then the last part that I'll say, you all are going to move into small group discussions in a moment, is that, again, I just want to remind you as I talk about whiteness, we're all born into the identities that we're born into, right? And nobody should ever have to feel guilty about their identity, ever, for any reason. But if our actions are out of alignment with our values, right? If I believe that racial equality matters, but when I have a moment to step up, when I have a colleague who's being silenced and I don't, what does that mean, right? Maybe that's the moment that I need to feel guilty and I need to reassess my behavior. Or if I see that a patient, right, I don't work in medicine, but if I see a patient is being treated in a particular way and I say nothing, what does that mean, right? So that's the challenge of talking about taking action. And I'll throw this up on the screen just so the recording and whatnot can capture it.